Okay, seriously, Ohio gozaimasu. And welcome to part two of my brief engagement with Kurosawa Kiyoshi and comedy, or perceived comedy. Um, I'm not going to engage exclusively or particularly in depth with creepy here. The reason why I've sort of picked this as a bit of a focal point or case study is because it's one of the few films that I've heard Kurosawa himself talk about with relation to comedy. Um, and then he did so, or has done, quite broadly. But it's not something that I've seen come up in a lot of different interviews. So it makes it an interesting site of exploration, I think. He said about the film, he was asked about the extent to which the increasingly sort of exaggerated scenario of the film or conceit of the film was intended to be blackly comic or humorous. And he said that he didn't particularly intend for anything to be overtly comic or for it to be viewed as comedy, but he can see that it's there. Indeed, Kurosawa has said about his films that genre is one of the key starting points for him. This reflects his much publicized love of US genre cinema, something that I've talked about and many others have talked about. And this is kind of the starting point for him, that he begins when he starts thinking about a story. He begins by, as it were, placing it within a kind of generic blueprint, or in a series of generic sort of boundaries that then for him, in various ways, shape and structure the story that he wants to tell. And this is interesting because I think what is of immense fascination with Kurosawa's work is the way in which this generic template that he likes to stick to and his own concerns sort of dovetail, but also kind of separate, run in parallel, and indeed perhaps comment on one another in various of his works. So there is a kind of complex duality, if you like, between genre and auteur. This is not something by any means unique to Kurosawa, but it is quite interesting here to note this, because the sort of appearance of comedy would not seem to have a lot of overt traction, if you like, in this view of how his films develop. That, of course, you can have sort of comedic moments or comedy relief that doesn't destabilize any overarching sort of generic identity. But in the case of Kurosawa, his own sort of authorial proclivities don't really lend themselves to this, and the genres that he has worked in don't really lend themselves to this. Whereas when we think about sort of comedy relief in certain contexts in, for instance, Hollywood cinema, we would think about sort of blockbuster action films or thrillers where said relief is kind of inbuilt into the generic template itself. It's kind of baked in, if you like, to a certain extent. Or otherwise, you would think about directors who have a sort of leaning in one way or another towards comedy. And with Kurosawa, this isn't really the case. So the presence of comedy, or perhaps we should say the inference of comedy, is something that kind of arises, I don't think organically from the material. Now, this is arguable, but I would suggest that it does not. And for most people who have found his films blackly comic, as I've said before, I don't think they really interrogate this, so it's hard to really know where they're coming from. But my supposition would be that Kurosawa sort of turns things up a notch or two as his films develop, and the kind of conceit that he follows, or the kind of allegorical, kind of strange narrative worlds that he develops, films like Charisma or Doppelganger, that people kind of inherently view them as comedic in a way that says, I think, more about them than the films, that they are trying to find some sort of common ground to engage with these films. And if and when that doesn't seem to be forthcoming, then I think falling back on seeing it as a comedy, I think in some ways removes any sense of responsibility on their part to actually actively engage critically with the film. So it seems in some ways like a sort of lazy, almost defense mechanism on the part of certain critics. That's not to say anyone who's ever found his films funny is being evasive or lazy. And of course, this is, any of this is arguable, but this is just my supposition. If you have different views, if you have different sort of examples of critics that I may not have come across, or reviews more to the point that I may not have come across, then please, by all means, let me know. Comment in the box and we'll talk about it. So, Creepy, for those of you who haven't seen it, is well titled, albeit its title and what specifically, or who specifically it refers to, is typically for Kurosawa, ambiguous and open to question. The film is about a police sort of psychologist who finds himself, after an incident sort of spirals out of control and leads to tragedy and personal injury, finds himself leaving the force, and he moves house, having taken a job as a university professor lecturing on psychology and on sort of profiling in terms of criminals, psychopaths, what have you. It turns out, as luck would have it, or not have it, that one of his new neighbours is a kind of strange individual, a strange man who seems to live with his wife and daughter. The wife is apparently sort of bedridden and very little is seen of her. His daughter, goes out and about, goes to school, and initially they seem to have a fairly healthy relationship. But as the film progresses, there are twists and turns to what this man is doing and what he ultimately does that kind of obliterates any notion of a stable or happy family. And this is one of the things that Kurosawa is sort of commenting on. I think it's actually, in thinking about this film, as humorous. Those of you paying attention at the beginning, or those of you who know your Japanese studios, will note the presence of Shochiku here. This is the studio most renowned for the Shomingeki, the home drama. This is where Ozu Yasujiro in particular spent the majority of his career. The vast majority of his films were made here. And this became something of a Ozu and similar sort of home dramas became something like the default setting, or the most readily identifiable sort of generic focus for this studio, and it became sort of aligned, for better or worse, with this kind of cinema. There, several, just as in Hollywood, in classical Hollywood, most of the major Japanese studios became affiliated in one way or another with a particular style and with a particular genre and with particular filmmakers. And this is largely where Shochiku's identity lay, and more or less lay still, even though there have been times, most notably with the New Wave, which a certain subset of which was known as the Shochiku New Wave, the work of the early work of Oshima, of Shinoda Masahiro, of Yoshida Kiju. They all got their start working at Shochiku, and the studio kind of afforded them a level of creativity and freedom. I think in part because they wanted to move away from the perceived connection between them and the home drama, and the sort of narrative and ideological conservatism that many have sort of read into this genre. Nonetheless, they have remained sort of connected to the home drama, and various directors have actually played on this. I think Kitano Takeshi's breakthrough 90s film Hanabi, his international breakthrough, is a film that was made and released through Shochiku, and that's a film that draws very heavily on the home drama, and I think offers a kind of dialogic engagement with this identity at Shochiku. And Creepy, I think, although Kitano doesn't really add comedy there, I think the fact that we have this very dark drama at the heart of Creepy, if we have the kind of typical Ozu film, if you like, as a sort of ghostly intertext with Creepy, there is quite a lot of comedy to be mined from thinking about this as a kind of twisted, I don't know, through the looking glass sort of retelling of a typical Ozu film. It's notable, I think, with questions in mind about what we laugh at and why we laugh, that there is, I'm loath to use the word realistic. I really do not like that term unless it is qualified and explored and explained in terms of its particular usage. But something naturalistic and something almost relatable about the extreme and increasingly kind of esoteric conceit and narrative of Creepy. I think what is really fascinating is the extent to which the actions of the two characters, of the negotiator psychologist and his wife, increasingly sort of provoke and indeed to an extent facilitate the actions of the apparently psychotic neighbour. The comedy in the case of the wife comes from her fundamental nosiness, the fact that she can't sort of leave well enough alone, and she has to dig into what this character's actually like, and she does this through being, on the surface, a good neighbour, trying to get to know her neighbours. She takes around a sort of welcome gift as an offering, and then she bakes food for them to try and inveigle her way into the house, and to, get to know him, his daughter, and apparently his bedridden wife, ostensibly. But I think there's a sense that she's, as I said, nosy, she's prying, she's probing. She can't just sort of leave it at having a kind of a sort of cordial but not particularly close relationship. She has to delve further. She has to know. It's a bit like her husband and his sort of psychologizing of psychopaths. She herself is trying to know more about this character, to learn, to uncover, but in a sort of gossipy way. It's almost like her husband's work rubs off on her, and she's sort of playing it out in a domestic key, in a domestic situation. So there's a kind of comedic discrepancy between her husband's profession and her personal life. And it kind of plays on this notion that these days everyone seems kind of disconnected from their neighbours. Although there's no narrative truck with things like mobile phones or social media at all. Nonetheless, the sense that everyone's lives are today fundamentally more insular, less communal, less public, more keyed into a sort of private interior space in which we exist with our phones and through our phones with the world around us. This tension is played out with the sense of getting to know your neighbours here. And it's not just the perceived psychopath. There's also a couple who live also next door, who the main characters meet on 2 occasions, I think, and who are similarly sort of brusque and warn against getting to know the neighbours. And the wife has to keep sort of pushing it, has to keep nosying her way in. So she almost kind of creates for herself this this elaborate scenario in which she is ultimately kind of imprisoned within the house of this psychopath. It's almost like what she wants taken to the nth degree. And there's kind of a black comedy in that, although, as I've said, it's not particularly played for laughs. But it's the tension between what the character wants and what she gets. The slippage there is, in a sense, comedic. And as I said, we all kind of recognise and in some way can relate to this sense of living insular lives. And there's kind of a sort of morality play here that I think has a potential sort of comedic undertone, wherein we see what happens to this woman who tries to be friendly, tries to be neighbourly, tries to get to know others, and it just leads to failure, just as her husband courts failure in trying to psychologise and get to know and profile different criminals. So like Charisma, which I'll be talking about in the next video in part 3, this is about failure, and it's kind of funny because we recognize the impulse that leads to this sense of failure. In a sense, we can relate to this impulse. It's also horrific and disturbing for the same reasons. But I think, again, that the dividing line between horror and comedy is one that is oftentimes very fine and not always easy to discern. So I think the scenario here is kind of horrific and comedic for largely the same reasons. And again, it's up to us how much we sort of invest in what we recognize in the conceit as being, you know, real, as being in some way universal. That's where both the comedy and the horror sort of arise from here. So I think that's, to my mind, the key point of interest in this film. And the fact that the psychopath is kind of, he has 2 or 3 or 4 faces, not necessarily depending on the perception of the characters, but just how he feels. you know, there have been comedic riffs on, you know, like the private life of secret agents, for instance, in notable Hollywood films. There's been the hit Korean film My Wife is a Gangster, and this is kind of riffing on the same sense of the mundane reality behind a facade of something, you know, either glamorous, exciting, dangerous, horrific. Sometimes the character of the psychopath, the neighbour, is quite nice. He, you know, and we don't really get the sense that he's putting on a facade. It's just that sometimes, you know, he's not some kind of uber villain out to wreak havoc. He's not in any sense a sort of psychopath that we could easily pigeonhole and define, as the lead character tries to do as part of his class at university. He's someone who just is, you know, kind of normal at times, which it's not an earth-shatteringly new conceit, but there is a sort of comedic value in recognizing how much perceptions and reality sort of collide, and the fault lines in amongst this collision can be comedic, can be funny, as well as, you know, being horrific at the same time. So there is this interesting sort of angle to the film from this point of view. And the fact that, as I started off by saying, the whole thing is kind of taking apart the Shomingeki home drama. It's like almost if Ozu made a horror film here. There is a strong sense of comedy to be had from this. And as noted, the sort of morality play of, you know, be careful what you wish for, be careful what you look for, because you may well find it. And the sort of play on the family as a fabrication, which, again, particularly in Japan, is something that has real thematic weight and substance. Okay, look forward to me discussing Charisma and maybe one or two other films as part of this series. Like, comment, subscribe, or don't, but do certainly comment, because I'd be intrigued to hear your comments on this particular film, whether you found it in any way humorous or funny. Follow me on X at AdamBingham01 and online for more Kurosawa material. I'm just posting a review of Wife of a Spy very soon, so look out for that at culturaljapan.com, and stay tuned for much more in the very near future. Thank you as always, and goodbye for now.